They say there's a hollow in West Virginia where even God refuses to look. A stretch of land so cursed that animals won't drink from its streams, and locals won't step foot past the rusted gate that marks its edge. There are no street signs, no road markers, just a dirt track that disappears into a wall of trees. And if you follow that track far enough, the forest begins to change. The air thickens, the birds fall silent, and as if the hills themselves are breathing, a mist curls low to the ground, carrying a stench that smells like wet earth and old blood. Once there was a town here, families, homes, a church whose bell could be heard for miles. But now Ashvale exists only as a shadow on yellowing maps, abandoned so completely that it's as though it was erased on purpose. And at the heart of it all was a single family whose name was spoken only in whispers, the Marrowbones. Welcome back to history they buried, where the past is never truly dead, just hidden. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning. This is the macabre history of the Marrowbone clan, a family so feared, so reviled, that an entire town was abandoned to bury their sins. By 1911, Ashvale was already a ghost town. What began as a booming coal mining settlement had crumbled into decay within just 2 decades. The mines were dangerous, unstable shafts that caved in regularly. Dozens of workers died underground, their bodies often left entombed where they fell. The company pulled out, the miners moved on, and Ashvale was left to rot. But a handful of families stayed behind. Among them were the Marrowbones. The Marrowbones weren't just poor, they were destitute. The winters in those hills were brutal, food scarce, and travel nearly impossible. Outsiders avoided the hollow entirely, claiming it had a heaviness, a smell they couldn't explain. The few who tried to settle near Ashvale didn't last long. Some left, others simply vanished. It was during this time that stories of the hollow's hunger began to circulate. Hunters stopped returning home. Trappers abandoned their cabins overnight, and the Marrowbones, once an unremarkable mountain family, were suddenly the subject of dark rumors. Locals whispered that they'd turned to something unnatural to survive. Whether it was hunger, madness, or something darker, no one could say. But as one old-timer would later tell a newspaper reporter in 1968, the Marrowbones didn't just live in that hollow, they became part of it. Before we continue with the story and its unspeakable secrets, this channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. Tell me in the comments what state you're listening from, and are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? The winter of 1911 wasn't just cold, it was unnatural. In Ashvale, Kentucky, snow fell so heavily that entire cabins vanished beneath white drifts, and the valley roads froze into glassy, impassable ribbons. The nearest railway line, miles away, was swallowed in ice, cutting the town off completely. Families starved that year. Farmers burned their last pieces of furniture for heat. Mothers rationed bread to a single crust a day, and grown men wept at their inability to feed their families. But there was one family who didn't seem to share in the suffering. The Marrowbone clan lived deep in a hollow where the trees grew too thick for sunlight to fully reach. While others in town grew gaunt and pale, they were seen trudging through the snow at night, dragging heavy burlap sacks toward their cabin. The sacks left long red stains in the snow. No one asked questions, not because they didn't want to, but because everyone in Ashvale understood that some answers weren't worth knowing. It was Reverend Elijah Pike, a man known for his steel spine and unshakable faith, who finally dared to climb that ridge. He went alone, carrying nothing but his worn Bible and a lantern. By the time he returned, his face was drained of color, his clothes stiff with frost, and his hands clamped so tightly around his Bible that the pages tore when he tried to open it. The next Sunday, Pike stood in the rickety wooden chapel and delivered a sermon no one would forget. There is a sickness in that hollow, a hunger not of this earth. Flee while you still can. If you wait for spring, you'll never leave alive. Those words sent a shiver through the congregation. Yet even then, most of them dismissed it as mountain superstition. People had always whispered about curses and haints in these hills, and hunger was known to drive folks mad. Only 3 families took Pike seriously. They abandoned their homes within the week, packing their children onto mule-drawn sleds and heading for the railway on foot through the snow. Those were the only families from Ashvale ever seen alive again. As winter dragged on, strange sightings began to spread like wildfire. Hunters swore they saw lanterns moving through the woods at night, swinging back and forth in slow, deliberate arcs, as if searching. A trapper from a neighboring county reported finding a blood trail so thick it soaked through his boots. He followed it all the way to the Marrowbone property, only to discover the snow around their cabin swept perfectly clean, the tracks erased with unnatural precision. Then came the screams. At first, they were faint and distant, carried on the wind like a dying animal's cry. But as the weeks passed, they grew sharper, more desperate, human. Some claimed it wasn't a man's scream at all, but something older, something that didn't belong in these mountains. The sheriff was called, but he scoffed at the idea of ghosts and curses. Ashvale was a dying town, he said, and he wouldn't waste resources chasing rumors. That spring, when the thaw finally came, Reverend Pike's warning proved prophetic. The snow melted, and the valley gave up its secrets. What they found beneath that ice would send the few remaining families fleeing into the night and silence the sheriff for the rest of his life. Next, we uncover what the thaw revealed beneath the snow, and why lawmen buried the truth instead of reporting it. When the ice finally began to crack in late March, Ashvale's silence broke. The rivers, swollen with meltwater, roared like thunder through the hollows, tearing chunks of frost-bitten earth from the banks. Trees groaned under the weight of their own thawing branches, and long-buried carcasses of deer, cattle, and smaller woodland creatures began to surface. Yet the horror that the melting snow revealed wasn't that of wild beasts. It was human. The first discovery came from a pair of brothers, Amos and Vernon Leach, who'd stayed behind that winter despite Reverend Pike's warning. While checking their hunting traps near the hollow, they found something caught in the roots of a frozen creek bed, a severed arm, pale and bloated, its fingertips gnawed down to bone. At first they assumed it was a casualty of frostbite or an accident, maybe a trapper lost to the blizzard. But as they followed the water upstream, more pieces surfaced. Shredded clothing, scraps of hair, and bones polished smooth by running water. By the time they reached the ridge above Marrowbone Hollow, the brothers stumbled onto something far worse, a clearing where the snow had melted into a shallow pit, revealing a cluster of skeletal remains. They weren't buried, not properly, just heaped together in a careless mound as though discarded. Some skulls were cracked wide open, others bore deep knife marks, and one was missing its entire jaw. What froze Vernon's blood was that these weren't old remains. They still carried scraps of rotting flesh, and the stench, sweet, rancid, unnatural, clung to their clothes for days. The sheriff finally rode out with a posse after the Leach brothers dragged one of the bones back into town. But instead of launching a formal investigation, Sheriff Rawlins grew quiet, uneasy. Witnesses later recalled how he stood at the edge of the hollow, hat in hand, staring at the clearings. Without a word. No sketches were made, no photographs taken, and the bones were hastily burned that same evening in a pit behind the courthouse. The sheriff told the town that wolves had dug up an old settler's grave. No one believed him. Reverend Pike, shaken but defiant, spoke out during his next sermon. Wolves don't crack skulls like nuts. Wolves don't leave their prey in neat piles. But no one dared challenge Rawlins. There was something about the way his hands trembled when he lit his pipe that suggested he had seen far more than he cared to admit. The official silence didn't stop the rumors. Word spread quickly that the Marrowbone clan hadn't been seen in weeks, not even gathering supplies. Some locals swore they'd spotted figures in the hollow after dark, standing motionless among the trees, watching. Others whispered that the screams that once pierced the valley were gone, replaced by something worse, an oppressive, unnatural quiet. One thing was certain. Ashvale was no longer safe. Families boarded their windows, loaded shotguns, and whispered prayers at night, while the sheriff began drinking himself to sleep. Whatever haunted those woods was still there, and now it knew the town had seen its work. Next, we go inside Marrowbone Hollow for the first time, where investigators found something far more disturbing than bones. Marrowbone Hollow had a reputation that made even the bravest hunters pause. The trees grew twisted and gnarled, their trunks scarred as though clawed by some unseen beast. The locals spoke of strange echoes, footsteps following travelers, and a chill that could sink into your bones no matter the season. But in early April, curiosity, or perhaps desperation, drove a small group of men into the heart of the hollow. Leading them was Deputy Silas Crow, a man whose calm exterior belied a mind sharpened by years of tracking poachers and runaway miners. Alongside him were Amos and Vernon Leach, still haunted by the remains they'd uncovered, and Reverend Pike, whose voice trembled as he read passages of scripture over the wind. The group carried torches, rifles, and a single lantern, its glass thick with soot from previous expeditions. The first sign that the hollow was unlike any ordinary forest came quickly. The snow had melted into soggy patches of mud, yet the ground seemed unnaturally dry in some places, forming depressions like the outlines of bodies pressed into the earth. Every step produced a sense of imbalance, as if the hollow itself were shifting underfoot. The men's shadows danced across the trees, stretching and twisting in ways that made their eyes doubt reality. They stumbled upon the first stone-lined pit, shallow but unmistakably human-made. Inside were remnants of old fires and strange tools. Knives and hooks, sharpened and clean, placed as if waiting for use. Crow picked one up, and the chill that ran down his spine wasn't entirely from the wind. Something about these implements felt alive, deliberate, waiting. The Leach brothers exchanged a glance, and Vernon muttered, "It's like they're still here, watching us." Deeper into the hollow, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of rot and something metallic, something that made Pike gag and retreat to the edge of the path. Every tree trunk seemed scorched in black patterns, and circular depressions peppered the ground, filled with ash and fragments of bone. Crow noticed peculiar carvings in the bark, geometric, almost ritualistic, and realized these were not mere signs of survival. They were markings, warnings, or perhaps invitations. By the time they reached the largest clearing, the group was tense, weapons raised, every sense on high alert. Here, the ground was littered with the remnants of old structures, charred wood, rusted metal, and the unmistakable shape of stone-lined pits similar to those discovered years earlier. But something was different. A low humming seemed to vibrate through the soil itself, faint at first, then growing, almost like the hollow was breathing. And then the shadows moved. Not the dancing torches. They were something else. Long, thin silhouettes, twisting between trees, darting across the periphery of vision. The men called out, but only silence answered. Only the hollow itself seemed to respond, pulsing with a quiet hunger. Reverend Pike whispered, "God help us. This is what the town has been avoiding." Amos stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soil. He froze. There, barely visible through the undergrowth, were footprints, not animal, not human entirely. Deep, irregular, smeared with mud, and unmistakably recent. Something had returned, or had never left. Next, we uncover what those footprints lead to, the first signs that the Marrowbone curse had evolved far beyond legend. The footprints led them further into Marrowbone Hollow, twisting through dense undergrowth and over exposed roots that snagged boots and rifle straps alike. Each step amplified the oppressive silence that had settled over the group, broken only by the occasional creak of a distant branch or the faint drip of water from melted snow. The deeper they went, the more the hollow seemed to close in, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. Deputy Silas Crow crouched to inspect the prints. He was seasoned. Years tracking lost hunters and poachers had made him confident, but these tracks defied all logic. Some were human-sized, yet elongated, twisted at unnatural angles. The mud held impressions of nails, fingers splayed wide, as though something had clawed the ground in a frantic, deliberate motion. Crow traced one with his gloved hand and recoiled, convinced the hollow had set a trap to test them. Vernon Leach's voice cracked. Do you see that?" Ahead, half hidden by a tangle of briars, lay the remains of an old deer carcass. But something about it was wrong. Its bones were picked clean, too clean, and the cuts were precise, surgical even, far beyond any hunter's skill. Amos swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. This isn't animal kills. Someone, or something, has been practicing. The group pressed forward, now tense, rifles ready, eyes darting to every shadow. The clearing they entered was larger than any on previous expeditions, and at its center was a stone-lined pit blackened with centuries of fire, but the remnants inside weren't entirely ash. Crow knelt, brushing aside the soot, and froze. Shards of bone, tiny fragments, some appearing to have come from more than one species. Human, he dared to think, though he did not voice it. Reverend Pike muttered prayers under his breath, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "God have mercy." His voice. He faltered as he noticed the circle of stones surrounding the pit, each carved with intricate symbols that seemed almost alphabetic, but not of any language he recognized. They radiated outward like a warning, a boundary, or a ritual site designed to hold something in, or keep something out. Amos shivered as he examined the area. There were remnants of clothing, tattered and dirt-stained, embedded in the soil around the pit. Small patches of red, long dried, stained the surrounding rocks. Vernon knelt beside one, tracing a bloodstain with his finger. "This isn't fresh," he said, swallowing, "but it's human." The air grew heavier with each breath, the sense of being watched intensifying. The wind whispered through the twisted branches above, sounding like faint voices just beyond comprehension. Crow signaled the group to move, but curiosity held them rooted. And then a sound shattered the tense silence, a low, guttural groan from deep within the hollow. It was not animal, it was deliberate, filled with pain, anger, hunger. The men froze. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but their eyes were drawn to a small mound at the far edge of the clearing. Something stirred beneath the soil, a movement that made the ground appear to shiver. Crow stepped closer, rifle raised, but even he felt hesitation creep in. That mound was not merely dirt, it was a warning, a signal that the Marrowbone curse had left traces beyond the ashes of the burned cabin. Reverend Pike whispered, almost to himself, "The stories. The disappearances, they were only the beginning." Next, we discover the first horrifying connection between the Marrowbone brothers and the missing hunters, a secret buried for decades that challenges everything believed about survival and morality in the Hollow. The night was settling over Marrowbone Hollow like a suffocating shroud. The small search party had set up a makeshift camp near the edge of the clearing, but sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, caused hearts to leap and rifles to be gripped tighter. Yet the pull of curiosity was stronger than fear. They needed answers, no matter the cost. Deputy Silas Crow studied the bones again, tracing the unusual cut marks with a trembling finger. He'd hunted deer, bears, and even wolves, but these slices were different. They were deliberate, precise, anatomically informed. The marrow had been carefully extracted, the meat removed in sections. Crow's stomach turned. This wasn't done by accident, or by an animal, he muttered. Amos's face paled. "You mean they ate humans?" Vernon Leach tried to shake off the dread, focusing instead on the surrounding terrain. "There's a pattern here," he whispered. "See these disturbed leaves and flattened patches of earth? They lead back toward the old cabin site, or what's left of it." The group followed cautiously, each step revealing signs of habitation long forgotten. Broken twigs that suggested traps, small fire pits cleverly concealed under leaf litter, and piles of stones arranged as markers. The first physical trace of human predation was subtle but undeniable. Half buried among fallen branches was a weathered leather pouch. Inside, faint but distinct, were trinkets belonging to the missing hunters, a silver pocket watch, a hunting knife, and a locket containing a faded photograph of a family. Reverend Pike recoiled, gripping his Bible tighter. "These were taken deliberately," he said. This is ritual, not robbery." Crow's eyes narrowed. "And whoever did it knew the terrain better than anyone. They could track, trap, and hunt humans as efficiently as game." He pointed to a trail of prints, larger than normal, elongated with an almost claw-like toe impression. They weaved through the trees, crossing creeks and ascending steep slopes with impossible ease. "We're not just tracking hunters," he said quietly. "We're tracking monsters, or men who have become monsters." The group reached the remains of what was once the Marrowbone cabin. Only the foundation stones remained, blackened from a fire long ago, but the surrounding soil told a story. Here, the ground was churned, mixed with ash, soot, and fragments of burnt bone. Crow knelt, brushing the debris aside. Hidden beneath the soot were remnants of clothing, tiny buttons, fabric fibers, and more bone shards. Reverend Pike's lips trembled. These are the hunters," he stammered. Amos stepped forward, voice shaking. "Look, this isn't just survival. Whoever did this wasn't desperate. They were preparing food, like it was part of a routine." The words hung in the cold air, heavy and undeniable. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the horrifying reality forced them to continue. And then a low scratching echoed from the tree line, faint but deliberate. Something, or someone, was moving just beyond the firelight, keeping its distance but watching. The hairs on the back of every neck stood on end. Silas whispered, "The Hollow remembers, and it's still hungry." Next we uncover the journals of the Marrowbone brothers, a chilling window into their minds and the methods they used to lure trespassers into the Hollow. Secrets too dark for most to imagine will finally come to light. What the search party discovered near the old Marrowbone cabin wasn't just evidence of human predation, it was a trail leading directly into the minds of the men who had committed the unthinkable. Hidden beneath a partially collapsed stone hearth, a set of leather-bound journals lay charred and blackened, the ink faded but still legible. Deputy Silas Crow lifted one carefully, his gloved hands trembling. As he turned the pages, the air seemed to thicken around him, as if the Hollow itself was watching. The entries spanned nearly a decade, beginning with mundane survival notes, hunting reports, weather logs, and stockpiles of meat and pelts. But by 1905, the tone had shifted. Tobias Marrowbone, the elder of the brothers, wrote obsessively about trespassers on their land. His words were meticulous, almost clinical, detailing footprints, travel paths, and even behavioral patterns. "All trespassers are property of the Hollow," one entry read, underlined twice. "They carry nourishment, both for the body and for the spirit. Only the worthy are spared." Elijah, the younger brother, seemed the only one retaining a flicker of conscience. His handwriting wavered across the pages, expressions of fear and conflict bleeding through the lines. In a September 1906 entry, he described watching Tobias set traps, not for deer or boar, but for men wandering the ridges. "I cannot reconcile what I see," he wrote. "He speaks of pleasure, not necessity. The hunger in his eyes is not natural. And yet, I remain complicit, afraid of what he will do if I resist." By late 1907, the journals descended into terrifying clarity. Tobias wrote of the ultimate sustenance, a term he used for human flesh, specifying methods of preparation with obsessive detail. Cuts were described with surgical precision, preservation methods meticulously noted, even recipes for roasting and smoking sections of the body. The thighs provide the strength of endurance, the shoulders the cunning of mind, Tobias's pen explained in a matter-of-fact tone that made Crow's stomach churn. Elijah's entries became increasingly fragmented and erratic. On December 14, 1907, he recorded a confrontation with Tobias over a young woman who had entered the Hollow, searching for a missing hunter. "Her presence crosses a line," he wrote. I see the glint in Tobias's eye as he prepares the fire. I am forced to witness what Father taught us in secrecy. I fear the man beside me no longer has a soul. The final pages were even darker, containing Elijah's confession. He wrote of striking Tobias from behind with a shovel, then burning the cabin in an attempt to end the cycle. Yet even in that act, he admitted the hunger remained, a silent, gnawing void that would never be filled by deer or rabbit. The craving persists, he penned. It will follow me west, into lands where my name is unknown, yet I fear it will never be silenced. If God exists, may he forgive what we became. Crow closed the journal slowly, the weight of the brothers' descent pressing down like a physical force. These weren't just reclusive men, they were predators, shaped by isolation and a twisted inheritance. The journals were more than records, they were a manual for horror, written by hands that had crossed every conceivable moral boundary. Next, we trace the chilling consequences of these journals, the evidence, the vanished hunters, and the local whispers that refused to die. The hollow's shadow stretches far beyond the burned cabin. The journals told one story. What happened outside their pages told another, far more terrifying one. 7 hunters vanished in a single autumn season of 1907, their campsites abandoned, supplies scattered, and rifles missing. For the local authorities, the disappearances were puzzling but not immediately suspicious. Mountain terrain was unforgiving, and the forest's grip could swallow the unwary. Yet those who knew the hollow whispered a darker truth. The Marrowbone brothers had claimed more than land. They had claimed lives. The first victim, a traveling fur trapper named Samuel Whitlock, was found missing days after leaving a trading post in nearby Ashcroft County. His horse returned alone, saddlebags intact, but provisions gone, and the thin smoke of a distant fire lingering over the ridge. Deputies found the camp abandoned, untouched but eerily arranged, as if its owner had simply vanished into thin air. No tracks led outward save those circling the fire pit, like ghosts pacing in a ritual. Subsequent disappearances followed a similar pattern. Each hunter was described as experienced, cautious, and well-armed, yet all failed to return. The next to vanish, Reverend Henry Caldwell, a traveling preacher, had ventured into the hollow, hoping to minister to isolated homesteads. His Bible was found in a crevice, untouched, but his personal effects were gone. Timothy, his assistant, later recounted the horror of the church's silent saddle returning without its rider. The community murmured about accidents and harsh weather, but even the most pragmatic were unsettled by the growing pattern. By December, the hollow had claimed Mary Caldwell, the sister of the missing hunters. Despite hiring a local guide to navigate the treacherous ridges, she too disappeared without a trace, leaving only her footprints in the snow, later obliterated by a merciless storm. Search parties cored the area, but the deep snow, steep cliffs and shadowed hollows seemed to conspire to erase all evidence. The mountain itself felt alive, a predator cloaked in frost. Local records reveal that Sheriff Hammond, overwhelmed by mine strikes, labor disputes, and a harsh winter, could allocate little time to a coherent investigation. Newspaper editorials attributed the missing hunters to poor judgment and inexperienced outsiders, masking the truth that fear had already settled over the hollow. No one dared linger, and fewer dared speak. The journals, when later discovered, cast an even darker light. They revealed that Tobias and Elijah's acts were not opportunistic. They were strategic, premeditated, and, disturbingly, ritualistic. Trespassers were methodically observed, tracked, and selected for sustenance, prepared according to precise methods inherited from their father. One page chillingly noted, "The oldest provides wisdom, the youngest, vigor, all contribute to the feast." The forest remembered these horrors. Even decades later, hunters reported inexplicable disorientation, strange noises circling their camps, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Animals avoided certain hollows entirely, leaving patches of forest eerily silent, as if nature itself had withdrawn in fear. Rangers noted equipment failures, sudden illnesses, and even faint traces of smoke and cooking pits in off-limit areas, despite no human presence. The hollow's shadow was real, and it lingered. It was more than a location. It was a memory, a curse, a warning embedded in the trees, stones, and soil. Anyone who dared to tread too close felt the weight of the Marrowbone legacy pressing upon them, an invisible predator watching from the dark. Next, we explore the terrifying letter of confession Elijah sent to his cousin, a revelation that explains the brothers' descent, their rituals, and the hunger that refused to die. The most chilling piece of evidence ever found in the Marrowbone case did not emerge from charred journals or fragmented bones. It came in the form of a letter. Written by Elijah Marrowbone to a distant cousin in Tennessee, the document surfaced decades later in a private collection. Its paper was water-stained, the ink faded, yet the words burned with the clarity of a man haunted beyond reason. Elijah opened the letter with a confession he admitted might never be read. "Dearest cousin," he wrote, "though we have never met, I write as the last of my blood. What I set down may never leave this paper, but it must be told before I vanish completely from this world." The tone was sober, deliberate and suffused with fear, the kind that creeps into the bones, not just the mind. He recounted the father who shaped them, Ezekiel Marrowbone, a man who survived the winters of post-Civil War Kentucky through methods so unthinkable that any rational mind would dismiss them as madness. Human flesh, Ezekiel taught, contained a vitality that could prolong life and sharpen strength. What began as a means of survival became an addiction, passed from father to sons through instruction, secrecy, and ritual. Elijah admitted that after Ezekiel's death in 1899, he and Tobias had initially refrained from following in his footsteps. Game and conventional provisions sufficed, but necessity and hunger are fickle, and by the brutal winter of 1901, Tobias resumed his father's practices, justifying it as survival when a lost trapper stumbled into their cabin, delirious and threatening. Elijah's words reveal a slow, horrifying transformation. "I saw the look in my brother's eyes as he prepared the meat, the same hunger father bore in his last days. Something fundamental had shifted, something no human should carry." The letter explains that by 1907, Tobias's hunger had evolved, no longer limited. To survival, it became deliberate and ritualistic. Trespassers were chosen with precision, their movements studied as meticulously as deer in the wild. Elijah's tone grows increasingly distressed as he details the events of Christmas Eve 1907, when he discovered Tobias preparing a stew containing parts of a young woman searching for her missing husband. The realization broke him. His brother had crossed an immutable line. Elijah described the act that ended Tobias's reign of terror. Using an army-issued shovel, he struck Tobias from behind as he bent over the hearth, then set the cabin ablaze with coal oil. "I told myself it was mercy, not murder," Elijah wrote. "The brother I had known was already gone, replaced by something that merely wore his face." The letter closes with a haunting reflection on the lingering effects of the Marrowbone legacy. "I feel it still, the craving father planted in our blood. In dreams I taste it and wake famished for something no deer or rabbit can provide. I go west to lose myself where no one knows the name Marrowbone. Yet I fear what father awakened in our blood can never truly die." The confession explains the disappearances, the abandoned camps, and the horrors described in the journals. But it also leaves a lingering, terrifying question. If the hunger can survive decades, does it persist in the land itself? The forests, hills, and hollows of Ashcroft County seemed to answer in silence. Animals avoided certain areas entirely. Hunters reported inexplicable noises, disorientation, and even faint traces of smoke in regions officially off-limits. The hollow, it seems, remembers. Next, we delve into the eerie aftermath, the charred cabin, underground pits, and the discovery of evidence decades later that suggests the hunger may have left its mark on the very soil of the forest. In the years following the Marrowbone terror, the forest seemed to swallow the past whole. The charred remains of the Marrowbone cabin, discovered in 1935 during a survey of Ashcroft County's remote lands, spoke of violence and secrecy, though the truth remained obscured by time. Timber blackened to splinters, stones cracked from intense heat, and the smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the soil, as if the forest itself refused to forget. What most startled researchers were the underground chambers. The cabin's foundation, when excavated, revealed stone-lined pits roughly 6 feet deep and 8 feet in diameter, hidden beneath layers of earth and debris. The lids, once heavy slabs of timber, had partially collapsed, concealing whatever lay within. Forest Service workers, following protocol, documented the pits but dismissed them as root cellars or storage for game. Yet bone fragments, oddly arranged, were discovered among the stones. Dr. Walter Richardson, a forensic anthropologist called in to examine the remains, noted the cutting marks were precise, too precise for ordinary hunters or trappers. His preliminary report concluded the bones were non-human, likely deer or wild boar, but he cautioned that without complete specimens, he could not rule out human remains entirely. The accuracy of the cuts suggested intimate knowledge of anatomy, knowledge that aligned with the meticulous entries found in the Marrowbone journals. By 1936, the cabin site was covered again, and the pits filled in. But the area, officially incorporated into Ashcroft National Forest, carried an unofficial warning. Rangers stationed nearby began reporting strange occurrences. At night, distant sounds, footsteps.